Thank you.
Ms. Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions, completely different issues. One is, and this may have been better directed to the our LAO witness earlier, so I apologize, I'm hitting you with it. A lot of what we're talking about today are goals and how they're actually trackable and traceable to what is being spent on. And for the goals that you have, which ones of those are ones that the legislature has not come together in consensus and said, these are the ones we want you to have? There may be some that you've set that are either outside of that or ones that perhaps as a legislature we rejected and couldn't pass. And that may be something that would take longer to go through than in the time we have here, but that is something I would like to see. I don't know if the rest of the committee, I'm sure, would as well. But again, the goals that you're setting, particularly for greenhouse gas emissions, which ones are ones that we've told you as a legislature and the governor signed into law we want to have happen? Which ones actually have we rejected and said we don't think are the right goals that you might have in some other way be hitting for? Is that something that you can provide?
Let me take a shot at it, and if it's incomplete, certainly we can have a little back and forth. But I would argue, I go back to three principles: reducing emissions of toxics and near source exposure, reducing criteria pollutants that form ozone and other substances that adversely impact health, and reducing GHGs. All of those have targets and directives in legislation. Toxics, there's a whole series of toxics legislation that passed many years ago, and clearly the criteria pollutants is a federal Clean Air Act requirement, as well as a series of state law, and Dr. Ayala talked about climate legislation, including AB 32. A point, though, that so each of those bills, and it's a series of legislation and directive, I would argue get at and direct us to reduce emissions of each of those pollutants: toxics, criteria pollutants, and GHGs. And the fact of the matter is, many of the strategies that we're talking about here today, many of them achieve multiple goals. There's not a, well, this is a GHG mobile source strategy, this is a NOx. The fact of the matter is, most of the measures that we are talking about deliver on at least two of those pollutants. Several of them deliver on all three.
So based on that, I really want to get back to the beginning on this and make it real simple. You know, regarding AB 32, how many GHG emissions have you reduced to date? And how many do you expect from light-duty vehicles, and how many have we gotten to date? We need to be able to know what you've accomplished straight up. It's a real simple answer.
So in terms of greenhouse gas reductions from the transportation sector, the information we have in front of you is from all transportation sources, not just light duty. We are on our trajectory towards meeting our 2020 goal. We are not there yet. Some of the critical measures, the energy efficient, the fuel efficiency measures for light duty in particular, will be really becoming effective over the next years between now and 2020. If you give me a moment to look at the chart, and I can give you a number.
Yeah, so what I'm asking for, since you identified the 2020 goal, where are you now at that goal?
So when we were doing the first scoping plan, the peak greenhouse gases was just a little over 180 million metric tons. We are down now to about 170 million metric tons, towards a target of approximately 150 million metric tons from the transportation sector.
Where did you expect to be at this time?
We are on the trajectory that we were projecting at this time.
So at this point in time, you're exactly where you thought you'd be for reductions?
Not exactly within the tons, but we're on the trajectory that we expected.
So have you met the expectation for today's date?
Yes.
So you're right where you thought you'd be?
Yes.
Okay. And those numbers can be shared with the committee, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we didn't get them in the matrix, is why we're saying. Thank you.
And again, just to put the finer point, because you asked about light duty, so embedded in the overall number, where we are in terms of the light duty fleet and reducing greenhouse gas emissions relative to our goal is we're a little over halfway there. I mean, just roughly, if you looked at the fleet and the natural turnover and some of the standards that have been put in place.
I appreciate it. Where did you expect to be if you're only a little halfway there and you have 4 more years to get there?
Well, we have, in terms of the light-duty fleet, because we are mandated by AB 1493, that doesn't have a 2020 sunset. Okay, we have a little bit further to go. Our goal really is 2025.
Okay.
So we have a little bit more time, and given the fact that we're about halfway into it, I would say we are making reasonable progress.
Okay. Any other questions of the committee?
I did have a follow-up.
Okay, I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Ms. Baker, please proceed.
The second question had, I would still like to see where you have goals that you have set into place and you are mandating and using your authority. Which ones are ones that are not specifically in statute and may have even been ones that we didn't adopt as a body, that we specifically rejected? If that takes follow-up independently, I would be grateful for that. On a separate point, and this goes to Mr. O'Donnell referring to cooperation and how you are monitoring what you're doing, do you make your processes subject to critical review and scientific outside independent review? When you say, yes, we've met this goal and it is because we did this regulation, is that out there for independent world to look at in full form to be able to scrutinize, like peer review?
It is. Our analysis, in fact, just very briefly, because I think it'll help in responding and making sure I'm crystal clear in terms of responding to your question. I talked about it starts with a standard. So I'm going to use a ozone standard as my metric here. So you have an ozone health-based standard. Health studies inform that standard. We have a series of standards EPA has established across the country. We have a challenge in South Coast and San Joaquin, particularly meeting the standard. We develop a plan. From that, what informs that plan is where are the emissions coming from? What is the emission inventory? From that emission inventory, it identifies where are the opportunities for reductions. Those opportunities for reductions ultimately inform an overall plan. There's reference to a state implementation plan. All that process and that documentation and that review is publicly available, and in fact, not more than publicly available. It's an exchange with stakeholders that may have a different perspective, different data, different input. That's just the plan stage. From the plan, individual measures, like a individual light-duty mobile source measure would be adopted. Well, that's another process that goes through stakeholder engagement. Where are the opportunities for reductions? What are the costs? What's the timetable? Is the technology available? All that analysis and assessment and recommendations, which ultimately is brought before a board in a public hearing, is public. In fact, that's what makes the process stronger, is the transparency that we go through. And I would ask anyone, stakeholders, to challenge my assertion in terms of the transparency of the process. It's quite transparent, and it makes it better.
If I may add on to the response of Mr. Corey, when he was using the example of an ozone standard that we're required to plan toward under the Federal Clean Air Act, in addition to developing the plan in a public process and submitting that plan to US EPA for their review, which they ultimately act on through their formal notice and comment process, we also have to report to US EPA our progress towards the targets we've established in the SIPs, to the overall targets in terms of how we are making progress towards meeting the health-based standards, but also what are called rate of progress targets. We have to have set within our plans minimum rate of progress of emission reductions, and we have to report to US EPA on a regular basis about where we are in that process. EPA acts on those as well through a notice and comment process. So particularly when it comes to the example of ozone, there's an extensive public process and review by other agencies.
Any other questions, this panel? So what we're going to do is we've pretty much done the the light-duty vehicle component of that program. And again, I think what I'd really like to see is for the information provided that we asked going forward in a timely manner. But let's look at your light-duty incentive programs, specifically the CVRP. Tell me about this program.
Well, I would characterize this is one of the programs that I think we as a state can be most proud of, because it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to do, and this gets back to the earlier question about the long-term goal. We have near, mid, and long-term. And long-term, what we really need to do with transportation is transformation. And that is we have to get to the extent that we can, we have to transform our light duty and the transportation sector to one that is as close to 100% reliant on zero-emission technology. I think that's a long term. But because we're developing a new market, you're essentially trying to induce a change in the market and convince the consumer that zero-emission vehicles are the right path forward. One of the principal tools that we have learned through research and other means is that you really have to incentivize the consumer. The consumer is looking for that signal that says, yes, I got to make this choice versus that choice. And rebates are one of the most effective. They're not the only incentive that one can give, but certainly a rebate like CVRP is one of the most effective means. And we're not the only jurisdiction that is trying this approach. There are many other states in the U.S. that are taking the similar approach, and frankly, around the world, there are many jurisdictions that are using programs like CVRP to, again, promote this transformation in the light-duty sector. So CVRP, I would say, is one of the success stories, one of the fundamental strategies that we have in our toolbox to essentially transform transportation.
So for this program, you're able to tell us how much was spent to date, where for others you were not for this program. Was it tracked differently?
No, so I can give you some numbers, and in fact, I'd be happy to recycle some information that I used at a hearing just last week. Another committee, I was sharing this information. So to date, CVRP, specifically the rebates, we've spent a little over $206 million. And again, this is over multiple years. The program has been in place now for about five years, to 2010. Okay. We've spent $206 million, and as I said, and we've issued about 130,000 rebates to date.
So how many cars are on the California highways at any one given time, or ownership in California?
So that's a large number. Our total light-duty fleet is on the order of 26 million. Okay, that includes light-duty, again, not just passenger
Approximately
cars.
23 million light-duty vehicles.
23 million?
So how many cars have CVRP funded? 130,000, 135. So we have a long way to go.
Yeah. Mr. Dodd?
I think what we're looking for is some sort of metric. So at the end of the day, whether it's this area or another area, you say, okay, well, how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions did we reduce by spending $206 million? And it just sounds to me like, even before when we were talking about the light duty, program, that's maybe an area which you guys are going to need to go back and work with each other to try to figure out a better way of communicating this, because to me, those benchmarks sound pretty simple. And that's what we ought to be looking at, engaging our investments on, whether it's here with this program or a number of different programs, and to see if those investments are lining up with the ultimate goal that we had at the beginning of the program in terms of where we want to be in the future, what our goals are, and what that's going to cost us.
No, absolutely. I think we all acknowledge that. We'd be happy to continue to work closely with the committee and the committee staff to give you these numbers, because I think it's not an issue of not having the data, it's just not having it quite in the format you need it. And again, just to give you a sense that we do have the numbers, CVRP, if we know how many cars we're putting on the road, we certainly know what the baseline for the fleet is. So I can give you a number. For the cars that we have incentivized, our emission benefit, our lifetime emission benefit, is approximately 6.5 million metric tons of CO2. right? So that's an easy calculation because we know that the cars are going from combustion to zero, and you just multiply by how many rebates we've gotten on the road. So we'd be happy to work with the committee staff to provide that information, but we do have, in terms of not only the monies and the number of rebates, but also what the emission benefit has been today. But let me just leave you with this thought, though. What we're trying to do here is really disrupt the future. So the real benefit from something like CVRP is not how many tons we got today, is really what is that going to do to eventually let us down a path where the entire fleet is one that is close to zero emissions. And I think that's where some of the focus should be.
Mr. Wisowski and Mr. Roth?
So in
Mr.
6
Dodd.
years, we've got 135,000 vehicles. So that's about 22,000 vehicles a year. And our goal is to get to 1 million vehicles in the next 6 years. So tell me how the program as it is, if we don't tinker with the program at all, how do we get an additional 865,000 ZEVs given the incentive programs that we have right now?
So the good news is it's not quite 22,000 a year. It's not a straight line, but it's more like a hockey stick. And the reason I say it, we started with a few cars early on, and now we see an increase, an acceleration in the take-up of these cars. The reason I'm saying that is good news is because, again, we expect over the next few years to have more and more demand for these technologies. Agreed, we are looking very closely at whether we're going to get to our target for 2025. We are confident that we are going to get, if not right on the target, very close. And part of the challenge, again, is because you have to consider the technology is not static, right? In other words, I like to say that we are getting better cars coming to market. You see advertised by some of the car makers, they're bringing cars that now have, at a minimum, 200-mile range. So those are better products that people are going to respond to differently than what we have seen in the past, which is typically, 100-mile range. So the technology is evolving and improving. The market, the automakers, are responding to that demand.
But also the market, as we all know, the price of oil has dropped precipitously, and now we have, I think I paid $1.76 in Carmichael last week for the cheap gas. So how does this incentive program actually affect the consumer when you have these other external world market factors that are going in? Is it enough, I guess, to incentivize it?
So that's a very good point. And again, obviously, we're tracking very closely. This is a complex and dynamic issue, but let me just give you a piece of information. Yes, the price of fuel is low, but if we look at if you were to look at our data from CVRP, and we are, and we'd be more than happy to provide this, it seems to be that low prices for fuel is really impacting the plug-in hybrid segment of the market, less so that pure zero-emission vehicle, the batteries and the fuel cells. So I think there's a lot of learning that we have to do there, because what this means to me is, one, the market is responding and people are recognizing more fully the true benefit of a zero-emission vehicle. Otherwise, you wouldn't see this bifurcation of the impact given low prices. But again, we'd be more than happy to get into a deep dive on some of these issues. The information is something we have, and we'd be more than happy to sit down and provide that to the committee.
Senator Roth, thank you for that.
Maybe this has been asked and answered. So if I read this spreadsheet that somebody prepared, your goal is 100% zero-emission vehicle by 2050? Is that the goal?
Roughly, right.
So how far along are you in terms of a percentage?
So we have a long way to go. And the reason I hesitated to the answer is...
Sounds like we don't like the answer.
Right. In 2050, what we would like to accomplish by around 2040 or so is every new car that is sold and bought in California. We would like that car to be a zero-emission vehicle, so that by the time we roll around to 2050, the fleet as a whole, where you have new and used cars, is mostly zero-emission vehicles. So if you consider that by adopted regulation, we need to be in 2025 at about 1.5 million vehicles. So you can see that the state sells about 1.7 million new cars every year. And as we mentioned before, we have a fleet of roughly 23 million cars. So if you can make that extrapolation, we're just at the beginning of the market transitioning to that future goal where most of our cars need to be zero.
I've tried to make this point before. $200 to $300 million is not play money here. And last week we were talking about a expenditure plan of about $3 billion or $3.1 billion. And that is clearly not play money. And given the fact that you all are scientists, I would expect, and I'm not, so I defer to you in many respects, but I'd certainly expect a little bit more rigor devoted to measurement and being able to answer the very specific question on, in 2016, how far along are we in terms of meeting our goal in 2050 of 100% zero-emission vehicles? And, hoping and expecting and wishing, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and certainly billions of dollars, is not the way to spend the money of Californians in this state. And you all have done a very good job. I'm not going to be critical of your goals, but I think we need to be measuring this stuff with a lot more rigor than I've heard. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Todd, did you have a follow-up question to your?
Well, I just came up with, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just came up with a number of $31,690,000 per metric ton on just what on this program. I think the math is right. So I guess the thing is, do you have off the top of your head, is there a key metric at all in terms of, what's a good investment in carbon reduction, or what other investments have been made in carbon reduction that we might be able to look at to see if this is a good investment on behalf of the taxpayers? And look, I know this is also in the early years, and the more you get and the more you take off the road, that investment's going to get better. But I think to the general's, senator's, question, I think that the rigor of the data and really understanding where we are to date is very important.
I mean, just briefly to react to that question, I think one thing that we have to keep in mind, again, is if you do the straight calculation like you just did, we are missing actually capturing where most of the benefit is. And again, this is something that we, as well as some of our sister agencies like the Energy Commission, who also have a role in transportation electrification and the activities that the state is undertaking. We are very much involved in funding the research and working with the national labs, for example, who can actually help us figure this out. But what I'm getting at is it's not a straight calculation of number of cars versus tons, because, again, this is a brand new market. This is like when the cell phones first came out and they were very clunky and very expensive. If you were to just do a straight cost and the benefit, you would never gotten to what we have today. And I think cars are no different than that, because the true benefit of the investment is really not just the straight emission reductions you get, but really is the potential to actually get us over this hump so that we can transform the entire fleet. And again, there are scientifically rigorous approaches that we have taken to try to get our hands around that issue.
Well, I think if you track that metric like somebody member Dodd is talking about, and you have that $31 million per metric ton, and then you go out 5 years and you say, well, now we're $25 million, we show progress. What we're looking for is that the money is actually making progress going forward, and that is measurable. We need to be able to account for money spent. And so when you show the hockey stick, there should be a cheaper cost for more metric tons reduced. And that's what we're looking for. Again, it's when we might be able to be helpful to tell you, well, we don't think that this is a good investment. We want you to allocate resources where you're really making strides. And we think that you can be more aggressive in this area with this investment. It's nice to have 50 programs going forward, but if they're not achieving, and Mr. Corhead said there's different silos in that, which is what I would also wanted measured going forward, but us being the funding partners and saying, we want you to be more successful in this area because you're going to catch your goals sooner. And maybe this is attainment here is 90%, and that's pretty good. But the last 10% is economically infeasible, or it stagnates assets, or return on investments aren't captured in programs or private industry. What we want to be able to do is be a partner.
Absolutely. And I wanted to have a follow-up response because the question about cost effectiveness, and I think the context was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in the context of cost per ton of CO2 GHGs. An important element, and there is an annual report actually that DOF will be submitting to the legislature. It's due in next month, end of March, all right? March 1st, on the GDRF expenditures. Basically, what's the status of the program? And you all know that ARB is an important recipient of the appropriations that you provided, as well as another dozen agencies, and 60 or 70 types of project types, and the reporting on that and the effectiveness and the status is really a critical part of the oversight and documentation. And, we look forward to that report, getting it to you, and the opportunity to talk about it. But I did want to make, I think it is an important point, and that is that looking at, in terms of cost effectiveness, in terms of dollars per GHG, it's important, no doubt about it, and I'd be the first to say it is. But it's not the only metric, because what you'll find with some of these projects, there's significant co-benefits. They're reducing diesel particulate matter. A heavy-duty demonstration project may be employing a hybrid or electrified technology, and it may be early in the development stage, may be higher on GHG, but it may be reducing diesel PM, and it may be in disadvantaged communities. And I'd be the first to say it's on us to be really clear about what those other co-benefits are associated with projects that ultimately receive support.
Understood.
And if I may, let me just come back to the question.
And if you can keep it short, because I do want to move on to other programs.
One of the things I want to do is that we give you sufficient detail in our answers so that you at least have a sense that the information that we have that we can share with you. But back to the point about success. Certainly, one of the metrics that we look at is how the market is developing. And when you look at zero-emission vehicles, the fact that this year the car makers are bringing 37 different models that are going to have a plug, when you consider that in 2015, it was only 25 models. That, to me, is success. When you look at the fact that the ZEB market is growing at about 5% relative to last year, that, to me, is success. Clearly, it's not all due to CVRP, but to a large extent, we look at incentives and a regulatory program in a combination to kind of make this market happen.
We're not here to argue your successes, and actually, we applaud them. We just want to be able to measure. That's how any private firm would be able to be accountable to their shareholders on performance and how the money was spent. That accountability, transparency kind of thing. And if they're not working, we need to know that there's a willingness to go forward and reallocate resources to things that do. So that's what we're looking for. That's the whole purpose of an oversight hearing. Nothing more, nothing less. But let's move on to the heavy-duty vehicles, okay? Regarding AB 32, how many GHG emissions did you expect to reduce in this category by now? And how many have been reduced to date? And how much have you spent on programs in this category to date? So how much did you expect to reduce? How many have you reduced? And how much money has been spent on GHGs in the heavy-duty vehicles?
I'm going to give you the global number, and then I'm going to let my colleague, Mr. Caparas, make sure that I got the inventory number right. But heavy duty is responsible for about 20% of the greenhouse gases. When you look at our greenhouse gas inventory and where we go to get reductions, the heavy duty sector accounts for 20% of those greenhouse gases. So that's what we have to work with. And when you look at criteria emissions, and certainly the most critical at this point is NOx. The heavy-duty sector accounts for about 80% of the total inventory. So you can see that if you just count number of heavy-duty vehicles, it may not be the largest share, but certainly when it comes to emissions, it is one of the principal sources that we need to handle. So I got those numbers right. In terms of how we are making, what progress we're making in terms of reductions, the principal policy that the state has adopted is the truck and bus regulation that is one of the entries on your matrix. And we are about halfway where we need to be. By 2023, we're going to have every heavy-duty truck in the state in use, meeting the most stringent, cleanest air quality standards. And again, we are, being the fact that it's 2016, we have...
So let me interrupt you. So I appreciate the history lesson, and I do. But we just really want the information on how much you've reduced, what did you expect to reduce, how much has been reduced, and how much you've spent on that. And that's what we're looking for on that question. So how much did you expect to reduce in the heavy vehicle program? How much have you to date, and how much have you spent?
So
please.
The goals driving the heavy-duty program, again, not to go back to the history, but the goal driving the heavy-duty program on the criteria side was really the identification of diesel as a toxic air contaminant. Once that identification happened, we at the state level, at the Air Board, had to develop a plan to mitigate that. So the goal was to reduce the risk of exposure to heavy-duty emissions by 85%. So, and that was by 2020. So you can see that we are on track to meet that target. What has happened over the years since we started this cleanup plan is now we are looking at the future in terms of how we can use what we've done to also get greenhouse gas emissions, which we also have, and further reduction in other emissions. So I apologize, but it's complicated because there are multiple elements.
I'm going to give you plenty of time
into the policy.
If it's complicated, I'm going to give you plenty of time to explain it. So you've got an 85% reduction goal. Where are you at this point?